the Labour Party will be announcing their new investment strategy by cutting red tape. Keir Starmer will promise to slash red tape and rip out the bureaucracy that blocks investment as he hosts hundreds of global business executives for a major summit in central London. After a troubled run up to the event, including a bruising row with a Dubai based owner of P&O Ferries, the Prime Minister will urge the world's largest businesses to invest in the UK, promising them stable policy and low regulation as an incentive to do so. Starmer will say in his keynote speech on Monday, "We've got to look at regulation where it is needlessly holding back the investment to take our country forward. Where it is stopping us building the homes, the data centres, warehouses, grid connectors, roads, train lines, you name it, then mark my words, we will get rid of it. We will rip out the bureaucracy that blocks investment, and we will make sure that every regulator in this country take growth as seriously as this room does." Now, this isn't exactly a new argument. In fact, this is all I've heard for decades. It was one of the most prominent arguments for Brexit, and it is incredibly similar as to what David Cameron was calling for back when he was Prime Minister. Essentially, many right wing politicians have been pushing for more deregulation, and here is the leader of the Labour Party calling for the same thing. Helena, obviously, when taken at face value, this is a classic neoliberal policy of deregulation to woo capital, as we know. That cost of deregulation can be incredibly high, namely Grenfell, in which politicians poured their hearts out over recently as it was the anniversary. So, do you think this is more of the same neoliberal economic policy? Is this the type of thing that could see another Grenfell? Or is this a necessary move because we know there are some issues such as planning permission? That can get quite bureaucratic. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, most regulations are in place for a reason, right?
Mm.
One of the things that was proposed by the Conservative government previously was removing a bunch of environmental regulations or changing the onus of the environmental regulations to be put upon local authorities rather than on construction companies when they were building new housing estates, which of course would mean that the environment would suffer because again, these are all externalities that capital doesn't take an account for. When you're engaging in a market transaction, an externality is any outcome of that market transaction that doesn't affect the two parties between them. So, for example, people who are selling the land to be able to use for construction and the government, right? If they get rid of that regulation, they are removing that externality because, again, their partner in this transaction, the capitalist within that market transaction, doesn't actually care about whether or not there is environmental damage or there are lax building regulations that mean that we get another kind of Grenfell because that environmental damage or that loss of human life, that is irrelevant as per the profit and loss of the company in that instance. So when we have these regulations, they are specifically there to protect against those externalities. And if we continue to remove regulations, we'll continue to see more of those things happen over time. Now, as you say, I do also 100% agree with you, Curtis, when you say, oh, well, also on the other hand, we have not regulation specifically, but blockages in the planning sector,
Mm.
which Keir Starmer and Labour Party have clearly been pretty they focused on pretty heavily during the election campaign the idea that they're going to be backing the builders and not the blockers when they get into government. And this is something that I broadly agree with. I have get frustrated with the NIMBY nation, as
Mm.
people have definitely seen in my comments previously and things that I've said, especially when we covered like the Green Conference on the channel, and a party that I am the member of. And I think it's very fair to say, well, given the local planning consent model has led to 14, almost actually 30 years really of stagnation, we've not had a new reservoir built in this country since 1992. And whilst, of course, the capitalists who own the water industry haven't wanted to do that investment anyway, even when they try to do the investment, in the very few instances that they do, these all things get blocked by local residents. And so pretty much I'm pretty Jinping pilled, let's say, in terms of allowing the state
Mm.
specifically to mark projects as being of national importance, therefore overriding local planning consent models to ensure these things get built. Because, of course, as long as you have good state regulation to ensure that you don't have something going wrong in the neighborhood because capitalists doesn't have to care about whether or not they cause environmental damage, for example, then that's fine. But of course, they're also saying they want to get rid of those regulations too, and that's where I draw the line.
Yeah, because I'm frustrated as well when it comes to house building, and absolutely there are some bureaucratic planning permissions, and that's often people complain to the local council, and even if they're not upheld, it slows the process down. I mean, let's be honest. I'm sure people watching have had this experience where someone decides to, put in some sort of not complaint, but they'll say, "I object to this planning," and it could be for the most mundane, silly reason, but that slows the entire process down. But the thing that tells me that this is just a neoliberal policy is because, yes, he does mention homes, right? And again, tweaking some planning reform is fine. But he's talking about overall infrastructure, which to me sounds like it could be a bonfire of important regulation. So I want to ask, will this even bring in investment? I mean, does the policy of deregulation even work? Is this the only thing they can do, given that it seems Labour isn't keen on investments led by the state?
I mean, if you are going to get rid of state investment and expect the private sector to be able to pick up the slack, anything that would make it easier for them to make money is something that's going to make them more likely to invest, right? When you make an investment, you're doing it because you expect a return on investment.
Mm.
Again, the externalities are irrelevant to you. And therefore, if the state makes it easier for you to make money, then you're more likely to make that investment. But then you've got to think, well, is that infrastructure actually going to be properly for the public good? There's been plenty of coverage in the news and within the print media, especially around the talks between Rachel Reeves and certain kind of private investment firms or people who are in hedge funds, for example. I mean, they just got a big donation from a hedge fund, or indeed the asset managers like BlackRock in trying to get them to finance a lot of these new infrastructure. We have access to like an infrastructure bank, but that's only be dealing in like single £1 billion worth of infrastructure investments. And that isn't going to be good enough, even if they change the fiscal rules to allow that to expand somewhat. And so they're going to rely on having these huge private equity on asset management firms own a bunch of our infrastructure. So is that new infrastructure that they potentially do create? If that is something that does get built for private interest and private ownership, like how much is that actually going to properly benefit the population? If indeed they start doing it for private gain, depending on the size of the contract that they get, what's the cost going to be? Is it actually going to be in a position where it's going to be for the use of everybody rather than just those who can afford to use it, which is of course one of the beneficial parts of state investment in infrastructure, is that you can ensure it's being done for the public good and in some cases free at the point of use, or at least minimal cost at the point of use, which you don't necessarily get from a private investment firm. There was a recent infrastructure project that was happening in London recently. I forget which one it was, which literally could have been done by the council, but was being sold off to some private owner who was going to get 100-year access to the revenues that are generated from
Was
that.
that to
So
do with the
all
toll
it's going to
bridge?
be, yeah,
And
I
they
believe
had
that
like
was
a
the one.
99 or 100-year lease, didn't they?
Yeah. So that's exactly what's going to happen, I believe, if we allow us to sell off our future infrastructure to BlackRock. And even then, you can't even necessarily ensure that this infrastructure stays for public use all that time if the private interests believe it shouldn't be in future. They are the ones who have control over this. And when it's infrastructure, this is critical for the functioning of our society. We've seen what happens when you let critical infrastructure fall into the hands of unscrupulous private companies. They weaponize it like places like the Macquarie did, the private investment firm, who use it to be able to take on debts under the company under the banner of the company, pay off their shareholders, and then scarper later on, leaving again the public to have to
Mm.
pay down those debts to be able to in increased bills or increased service charges for that existing infrastructure. So this is why state ownership is really important, especially in a time of geopolitical instability, because you need to ensure that the public, actually have ownership and access to that new infrastructure. You cannot guarantee that you stay in the good graces of those private companies for long, because if they decide they don't want to use that infrastructure anymore, they can make that decision all they want because it's theirs to do what they want with, because they're the ones who own it rather than the people.
And it's a real short-term policy if you think about it, because I and that's essentially it always returns me back to PFI, right? Which is that we can get lots and lots of capital to build these things, and it makes us look really, really good. Because sometimes the issues of privatization can take its time to really sink into the cracks to emerge, and often that government is now gone. And you can blame the failures, what happens afterwards, not on the root cause, but what's happening today. So we can say, well, Thames Water is completely broken, and you might get opportunist politicians to say the Labour government is useless, but really it's the root cause of it. So it really is a short-term policy. Now, we are often told, us leftists, that we're ideological because we believe that state-led investment is probably the best thing. I think it is the best thing. I think it's the most cost-effective, but it's also the best well-run. You don't get issues with investment being sucked out for profit. All these things. And we're told we're ideological, that, we're going to burden people with debt because we're going to spend so much money. And then politicians continue to go to private capital to fund these projects. Okay, for the first couple of years, everything looks nice and shiny, but give it a while and the cracks emerge. What's actually happening here is, whether it's a Keir Starmer-led Labour Party, whether it's a David Cameron-led Conservative Party, that is completely ideological. They're wedded to the private sector. They love privatization, and actually, using the state to fund things, that's the practical solution, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, like, what happens when you try and entice private companies in by saying, "Oh, look, low regulations"? You end up
Mm.
with free ports. You end up with special economic zones. I don't know if anyone's looked into what workers' rights look like, and I don't know the special economic zones in China, for example. Now, I don't think there's particularly good workers' rights there, or the suicide nets that people talk about, because again, if you deregulate, the externality is going to come in things that aren't relevant to the interests of these businesses, which is, of course,
Mm.
the livelihoods of the people who are supposed to live in these areas. So, you almost certainly allow yourself to give up some amount of public interest in the pursuit of private profit. Those things are two things that are in conflict, the public interest and private profit. And so minimizing private profit maximizes public interest and vice versa.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.